Bienvenidos. I am Trevor Williams at Global Atlanta. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the Global Atlanta Authors Amplified series, where we seek to elevate and amplify Georgia-based voices in the scholarly realm and beyond, but focused on international business and international affairs issues. And today we are excited to have a fascinating, what I believe will be a fascinating discussion with Pablo Palomino. I'll give us a little bit about Pablo's bio as we get into it, but he's the author of the new book, The Invention of Latin American Music, a Transnational History. So excited to have him here, so excited to have all of you here. But before we jump into it, I just wanted to make a quick note about our sponsor, which is the Atlanta Global Studies Center. The Atlanta Global Studies Center is a collaborative center between Georgia Tech and Georgia State University, and they are nationally funded Title VI center, but with the ambition of powering the region's global agenda, which is something we can all get behind here at Global Atlanta. We've seen that international education aligns perfectly well with what we do as journalists, seeking to showcase the city's global connections to the world. And so that's what we do at Global Atlanta. This series has been a fascinating ride so far. We've had three before this event, and this is the fourth one in the series. And looks like we're going to have an intimate crowd today, so which is going to be good. We can make more time for questions and discussions. Pablo is joining us, I think, from the West Coast. Pablo, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this Global Atlanta conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. Looking at your bio here, Pablo Palomino is a cultural historian. I want to get a little bit more of a definition from you on what a cultural historian is versus a regular historian, but a specialization in modern Latin America. He teaches, he's an assistant professor teaching at Emory University's Oxford College. Native of Argentina, got his PhD, well, one of his degrees from University of Buenos Aires, but did a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, was also a postdoctoral lecturer at the University of Chicago. And this, I think, is your first book, Pablo. Is that right?
It is.
You've written a lot, but this is the first one that's taken a book form.
Yes, it has a long history since its first inception in Buenos Aires a long time ago. Then it became a subject of doctoral research, then a dissertation, a Frankensteinian long, very academic dissertation. Then it took me some years in Chicago and now in Atlanta to turn it into a book. And it came out in the middle of the pandemic a year ago.
Yeah,
so,
I definitely want to get into what drove you to focus on that. A few other items of your bio that I thought were fascinating. You worked at something called Memoria Abierta, the Alliance of Human Rights Organizations in Argentina that created an oral history archive on state terrorism and political violence. I think that's fascinating. Just having been to Argentina one time, I mean, I'm not no expert at all, but I would love to talk to you about that at some point. But you also focus a lot on the Jewish diaspora in Latin America, and that really shows up in the book that we'll start talking about that in a few moments. And then you critique this concept of the global South. I really love that because, you know, we've encountered the global South in terms of the Southern United States. We're thinking about the South's, you know, the U.S. South's orientation to the world. But as I researched that term, I realized how loaded it is and how much it's used to kind of categorize this vast swath of developing countries in the Southern Hemisphere, or I guess developing in quotation marks. But you know, that kind of underpins a lot of your research as well. So we're going to jump into it. Tell us a bit more about yourself. You know, I guess you grew up in Argentina. But what inspired this long, circuitous route of study for you? I mean, do you have a musical background or musical history yourself, or did you just see music as the, pardon the pun, instrument for studying this history?
Well, thank you so much for your introduction, Trevor. And yes, I grew up in Buenos Aires, listening to music, to all kinds of music, probably like many other people in Argentina and in Latin America. You know, we grew up listening to our own local traditions, sometimes the folkloric one, the traditional ones, but also the the modern commercial ones that come from the Anglo world through the radio and the recording industry. And of course, in my case, I was very curious about music, so I always listened to jazz and to classical music, to traditional European music. But since I was a music fan and a guitar player as a teenager, I was always curious about the histories and the ideas, the identities that came with each musical genre. So somehow my interest in music was always a mix of like sonic pleasure, so a little bit of performance, and an intellectual curiosity.
Was your guitar playing just kind of a product of your cultural milieu, for lack of a better term, or did you was that in your family? Like, did someone inspire you to pick up the guitar, or was that part of this musical educational infrastructure that you talk so much about in the book?
Well, yes. When I was I forgot now, but 12. My grandpa gave me a Spanish guitar, what we call here will be an acoustic guitar. It's Spanish guitar. But then I began to play Brazilian bossa nova, something that I always found. So I always gravitated naturally to bossa nova because of its rhythm and the tragic mellowness of the love songs of bossa nova. Also, as an Argentine teenager, Brazil was close, but also so different.
Yeah.
And I would say that Brazil was the first sort of interest in Latin America beyond Argentina, as a musician, as a historian, as a music fan. But my grandpa gave me a guitar. So yes, I would say it's great to have this, that you pose this question, because I wouldn't know, I couldn't pinpoint like a moment or a situation. It's a mix of things that, put music sort of on my way. And in fact, I graduated from the University of Buenos Aires writing a thesis comparing the poetics of Buenos Aires tango and Rio de Janeiro's samba. Comparing Argentina and Brazil, two genres, two poetics. In the 1920s and 1930s, that ended up being the core of my current research. I think those are the years, the decades when sort of modern popular cultures were concocted in Argentina, Brazil, and I would say throughout Latin America.
Well, that really gets into the thesis of the book. I mean, you talk about the invention of Latin American music, but you're kind of talking about the invention of the concept of Latin America through music, which I think is just a fascinating twist, a rhetorical twist there. But there's, from what I read, I mean, I just finished reading it honestly this morning, but there's sort of an irony at the heart of your argument, which is that this regional concept of Latin America was formed out of this patchwork of nationalisms, like these the idea of each country developing music as its own, again, instrument for nationalistic kind of cohesion, became kind of the foundation that was able to have those things knitted together in a broader regional concept of Latin America. And I wanted to start kind of from the end, because one of your quotes at the end, you said, the region as Latin America may have been invented, and it may even look like Frankenstein from some angles, but the invention is certainly alive. And you said it was neither a self-evident truth or a colonial artifice. So it's this mix, this blend of nationalisms. But tell us about the thesis of the book, and how you see this concept of Latin America.
Sure. You're pointing to the core, the conceptual stakes of the project. And I think it's not just my project, but it's something, these are conceptual stakes that cross, I would say, cultural history and history in general of Latin America. First, I want to say that we tend to oppose spontaneously, for good reasons, nationalism and globalization. As if those were like two opposing things, to oppose, contradictory things. But what I found in my research is that the very projects, nationalist projects, that in each individual Latin American country created a national music style and a national cultural identity, each of those projects were at the same time part of global entanglements, of regional and global dialogues. You can see that in the way technological transfers to create the music industries, commercial networks that connected these different countries with each other, the poetic and sonic influences that the musicians, composers utilize to create their own music, and of course the audience's musical habits, in which you can find virtually everywhere in Latin America, people listening to sounds coming from multiple parts of the country, the region, and the world. So my interest was to find the connections between nationalist projects and global entanglements. And I found out that the nationalist projects were not opposed to globalization, but in fact were sort of drivers of globalization. Only when you have a national, commercial, educational, cultural systems, you have the sort of the infrastructure that allows for local and foreign sounds and actors and investments to circulate. So an important point I wanted to make is that, okay, let's see nationalism not as a bad thing, but sometimes it is a bad thing. Sometimes nationalism is xenophobic, exclusionary, it underlines the differences instead of the connections. But if you look at in the book, the history of music, it has some moments of chauvinism, but mostly is a history of nations coming together in dialogue, copying each other, connecting with each other.
Well, I think there's so much relevance for today in that discussion of nationalism versus globalization. I mean, I think we tend to, at least those of us who think about international affairs a lot, we tend to think of this like global citizenship again as an antagonism towards nationalism, and really, I think this kind of reckoning we're seeing in the world today is that people really still want to have a local identity that's tied to their country and their culture, and they're trying to negotiate what that means to continue to be integrated in the world through trade and culture, but also kind of retain that that local citizenship or root, and that's at the heart of what we write about in Atlanta. It's like how you're rooted in a local community but still connect with the world, and so that point is totally well taken in today's context.
Well, I would say that in the same way that Atlanta has its own local ecology of people, of businesses, of culture that is connected with a global stage. But in between Atlanta and the globe, you have a nation, no? A big, vast nation, the United States.
Right.
In a way, my book was an attempt to find out how in between each local or national culture in Latin America and the globe, globalization of music, how in between those two there is an intermediate dimension, a layer in between, that is this region that we call Latin America.
Right.
That, as you pointed out before, is a mix of a reality and a utopia. No?
Yeah, like a mythology almost. Yeah. Well, talk about there's kind of three countries at the heart of the book. There's, Argentina, which you're obviously very well familiar with, but then you also talk a lot about Brazil and Mexico. And, you sort of talk about this, the musical infrastructure that's being developed in the big metropolitan areas. Then you have kind of the countryside, this sort of criollo kind of mentality. And then you have the indigenous groups, and then you have the African groups. So it's all this kind of blend that comes together in different ways in different countries, and different places use music in their nationalistic projects differently. So can you talk about the way Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina use those things differently, and the way music kind of developed differently in each place?
Yeah, first we need to explain why those three countries instead of any of the other 30 that we have in Americas. Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico were at that time, and to some degree they're still, by far the largest economic markets and the largest demographic actors in the region. So I chose them because of their importance. And whereas the three of them received this mix of African, native, and European demographic and cultural influences, they processed them very differently. And especially in the 20th century, when they created their modern popular nationalisms, you have strong differences in, for instance, Mexico endured a revolution, a social revolution, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, that really marked the entire 20th century. And that was very much predicated on the valorization of the indigenous and especially of the mestizo, the mixed race national identity, which is very problematic in many ways because it excludes many like particularities, but at the same time, it wanted to be inclusive. Everyone is part of the mix. Somehow Argentina had a similar ideology, the Argentine elites, although in Argentina, the emphasis was put on the European component and in the criollo, sort of more Hispanic aspect of the local culture. Whereas in Brazil, because Brazil was organized as a modern country around the plantation slavery of African forced labor, especially in music, that the presence of African cultures was so central, was so unavoidable, that even with a supremacist or racist idea of whitening, modernity as whitening, when you look at music, which is the most popular of the arts, if you want, blackness and Africanness is central to Brazilian ideology. But the thing is, despite these differences, you find in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, intellectuals, musicologists, composers from these three countries and many others throughout the region coming together, concocting this idea of a Latin American music, as if it were like one big canon through which each nation has, represents a specific current or creek or branch.
Yeah. So why do you think it was that this time period, and I sent you a question before about, this being sort of an intra-war period, right? Like you've got the Great War, World War I, then you got World War II on the other end. But of course, as you read further in the book, it talks a lot about the US, kind of project to displace European influence in Latin America later on. But what, did it just happen to be a coincidence that it was 1920 to 1950, or what were some of the driving factors? I mean, Argentina in particular was, you revealed to be, and I think if you know anything about Buenos Aires in particular, so based on immigration, right? You talk a lot about Jewish immigration, you talk a lot about Italian immigration in particular in Argentina, but what were some of those driving factors that made this the time period that this idea emerged, I guess? Well,
this is a great point, thinking about the history of international relations and the role of Latin America. World War I was for most intellectuals and elites in Latin America a breaking point, because Europe, that was the model, the symbol of modernity, of culture, of civilization, they began to butcher each other in the trenches. The war was symbol of the decadence, the crisis of that European ideal. So it marked the beginning of a self-reflection. Latin American artists and cultural actors looking at themselves, looking their own native Creole, immigrant, whatever the mix, but their own cultural roots, to affirm them against Europe or in dialogue with Europe, but no longer just imitating Europe. Right. So this is the inception of both nationalism and regionalism, this Latin American. But World War II is very important too, because the United States wanted to create a sort of a cultural front across the Americas against against Germany and Japan too, against the enemies of World War II. So the State Department and many broadcasting corporations and many artists, like many of them coming from the New Deal of Roosevelt, began to connect through cultural programs, cultural diplomacy, tours, printing of scores, invitation to artists, to musicologists from Latin America, around an idea of inter-Americanism.
Yeah, and this was the musical division of the precursor organization to the Organization of American States, right? Like this was, and you point that out very firmly in the book, that this is basically the body that includes North America in the broader dialogue around this ideal of Latin America that's emerging, and how strategic that was. You know, the U.S. really saw that as strategic.
Exactly, and you know, when you have like a big empire, sort of producing a powerful discourse about the region and providing networks and funds for the actors in this region to come together and buy into that discourse and be protagonists of that discourse. Well, that was an important influence in sort of consolidating a regional idea that was already in the making for a long time, as I show in the book, in many angles. But I think that music and music activism, music diplomacy was key to sort of naturalizing the idea that, oh yeah, there's a region, Latin America. And despite the difference in size or cultural ingredients of each country, you know, because Panama is so different from Uruguay and Chile is so different from Cuba, and yet that's a region. And we can produce, you know, musical programs, musical education. And that, interestingly, that began to be, after World War II, began to be translated into non-musical domains.
Yeah, and that gets at the heart of your argument. I think that music helped create the ideal, right? Well, to talk about, you know, you get into so many different types of music, and you talk a lot about music education and the recording industry, and the way tension between the recording industry and what tends to be popular music versus what the kind of higher brow folks want to inculcate into their society. I thought that was fascinating, but I wonder if you could talk, particularly given your focus on this with your thesis, about tango, you know, because I feel like this is sort of a microcosm. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but tango seems to be previous to all this nationalistic investment in the music infrastructure, seems to be more of a Pan-American art form that kind of has its roots in Spain, right? But then it becomes Argentine, right? So it becomes, you know, purposely kind of constructed as Argentine. So tell me how that happened, and does that really represent a lot of different forms in the way that they were incorporated into the nationalistic discourse?
Well, Trevor, to ask an Argentine to tell you something about tango is an invitation to hours and hours of anecdotes and reflections.
That's why I picked it.
I try to focus. You know, in Argentina, tango is considered like, you know, the quintessential musical identity. But you know, historians and musicologists from Argentina and from throughout the world, even from Japan, like a good colleague of mine, Yuiko Asaba, is now researching on the history of tango in Japan, which is parallel to the tango in Argentina. In fact, there's a prehistory of tango as sort of a part of a family of rhythms that connected Cuba with Spain, with the Cadiz, you know, the southern Spain. And that then rhythms that were picked up by some French composers, like Carmen, the opera. You know, it's the habanera. It's one of the rhythms that are behind tango. But yes, tango began as a popular dance in the outskirts of Buenos Aires in the 19th century. And, you know, like many other genres in Latin America, it has this mix of rural and urban, or this sort of liminal border spaces in which different groups from the city and the countryside, but also from different social classes, get together. Particularly in Buenos Aires, around brothels. So prostitution, you know, in a region of immigrants, which were mostly young men, there were like rings, organized rings, and also spontaneous forms of prostitution. And tango was key to this ecosystem of brothels, and that also offered opportunities for musicians, some Creole, some immigrants. So you start having like the violin, the flute, like many of the instruments, and the bandoneon that brought that Mediterranean and Central European immigrants brought to Argentina. And you have very cheap brothels in the 19th century and very pricey ones. So tango becomes a sort of a
differentiator or something?
No, I would say no, the opposite. The sort of a magma yeah, like a material that allowed for the wealthiest Argentines, the ones who were the, you know, the landowners who lived like the elites in Paris or London, and the, you know, the most downtrodden of the local or immigrant folks, to sort of share an idea of masculinity, an idea of modernity that is very peculiar, very from the Rio de la Plata, not just Buenos Aires, but also Montevideo in Uruguay.
Yeah.
Then tango evolved into a mass commercialized, massively commercialized genre with orchestras, like tons of really great orchestras, you know, comparable to the US jazz bands of the 20s, 30s, 40s, you know, great musicians. Some of them trained at conservatories, like with formal musical training. Some of them more, you know, self-taught, spontaneous geniuses. And you have Creole musicians, you have Italians, you have Jews, you have Spaniards, in the orchestras, among the dancers, and among the producers and the people who began to write like music critique and journalism. So out of the conversation around tango emerged the first sort of national conversation about who we are musically speaking.
Right. Yeah, and I found that fascinating because you talk a lot about the kind of tension, if you will, between collecting this folk music or folklore music, that, you know, kind of figuring out what forms of music are central or unique about our country or our region. The tension between that and the music the kind of more technical music that we inherited from Europe, basically. And that tension is really at the center of a lot that you talk about.
I would say that the tension is mostly I would say that there's a tension between what was seen as organically real music, like the natural, actual, real music
of the people type music, yeah,
of the people, folklore. At first, musicologists considered tango as an aberration, as something weird, immoral, too tainted by immigration, like too foreign, too cheap, commercial, false. A little bit like jazz was seen in the US originally by many people who consider that you know, the English ballads or some forms of country music are the actual representation of the US, not this racially and sexually suspicious kind of music. Tango was just like jazz in that sense. Samba in Brazil was a little bit like that. But then over the period of time I covered in the book, tango ended up becoming part of our folklore.
Right.
The language of tango, the dance of tango is now, you know, you have it in the postcards in Buenos Aires.
Well, talk about populism as a core tenet of Latin American music. There were two figures I really found fascinating. One of them was Isa Kramer, this Jewish folk singer who finds herself in Argentina later in her life, but originated in Moscow and toured all over Europe, but kind of incorporated this globalist kind of folk music into her performances, and really loved the vaudeville shows in the US because she felt really connected to the audience in a way that she didn't while performing more highbrow things. But can you talk about her? I mean, I feel like she could have her own book, really. But it's really in the first kind of section that you mentioned her, I think, as an illustration of the way that music developed as a populist kind of ideal.
Yes. No. Yeah. You're right. She deserves a book on her own, for her own. Isa Kramer represents this, what I call transnational populism. Transnational populism. The idea that first modern popular music, at least in the 20th century, not just in Latin America, but throughout the world, is a transnational concoction, because when you pinpoint, the places where many of the artists live or perform, or at least maybe if they were just in one locality, the origins of the music they processed and they dialogued with are quite transnational. And populist, because I know that populist is a very contentious category, and it evokes like very, very bad things for good reasons, of course. But there's in the word itself, the appeal to the people, right. There is a kernel, a nucleus of democracy, mm-hmm. in a wide sense. So the populism I'm talking about is not demagogy or manipulation,
right,
or authoritarian definitions of what is the people, or who are the people and who are not. But no, this is a more democratic,
grassroots kind of, yeah,
open, transnational, not nationalist, transnational form of populism. Because you can see, in effect, Isaac Kremer in the 1920s was performing in Milwaukee and in Cincinnati vaudevilles, and she performed. She was a genius. She spoke like 12 languages or something like mm-hmm. that, and she sung them perfectly. Mm. And so she would perform Yiddish songs from the Russia or the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, but also songs from throughout the Mediterranean, like gypsy songs and Italian mm-hmm. songs. Then American songs, like folk songs or jazz ballads, because they were popular in the sense of appealing to the sentiments and the memories and the stories that people right. Bring to the music they enjoy. And then she ended up in World War II migrating to, right before World War II, to Argentina, which Argentina received many, many, many immigrants. Well, since the 19th century, but especially also right before World War II, many of them Jewish immigrants from different parts of Europe. And she simply, when performing in Buenos Aires and in Cordoba in Argentina, she began to integrate some Latin American songs into her repertoire with absolute naturality. It wasn't that, oh, this is a completely different songbook that only Latin Americans can sing. No, this is just Latin American music was for her one more item in her right. sort of global musical ideology.
Yeah.
So her case might be a little bit extreme because not all singers sing 12 languages or have lived in 15 different countries. But somehow I would say that most musicians, in terms of, and maybe I'm sure among us listeners here in this conversation, if we start like mapping the places where the genres and the artists that we like come from, mm-hmm. we will be pretty transnational too.
Yeah. I want to talk about that some more, especially in the modern world and the way we categorize music, for sure. But the other character that you really focus on later in the book that I think is really foundational to your thinking was Francisco Kurt Lange, the German immigrant who comes to Montevideo, Uruguay, and starts to catalog what he saw as Latin American music, and creates this publication basically that becomes the foundation for a lot of the connective tissue among all the different thinkers and recording artists and companies and things like that are creating music in all the different nations of the region. So can you talk about him and how you discovered his work and what it meant to the project?
Sure. I mentioned that since the 19th century and early 20th century, Latin America was an idea among many intellectuals and political actors in the region. And then how in World War II, the United States cultural diplomacy sort of contributed to establish the idea of Latin America as a region. But in between these two moments, Francisco Kurt Lange, or Hans Kurt Lange, as his original German name, he created this very idea of Latin American musicology out of a different source, not Latin American, not US, but German musicology. This sort of universalist approach to world cultures that organizes the entire planet into regions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like this is a racial ideology as well, but somehow this German immigrant musicologist just arrived in Montevideo as he was 20 something.
Mm-hmm.
Before getting to know Latin America, before traveling or just traveling a little bit through Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, he began to propose the idea that Latin America was a musical region, expressing a specific culture, different from the United States, different from Europe, different from Africa, different from Asia. And he's the one who created this connective tissue that that's a great metaphor that you propose through the Bulletin of Latin American Music,
mm-hmm.
In which composers, pedagogues, conservatory directors, ministers of culture, publishers, performers began to exchange techniques, ideas, prestige, because everyone wanted to publish in this bulletin, which I discovered, I didn't know it existed. I moved from Buenos Aires to Berkeley in 2007 to start my doctoral degree. So I went to the beautiful big library, the special collection in the University of California, which California, as you guys know, is from Buenos Aires to California. I covered the entire Spanish empire in the Americas, from one corner in the south to the other in the Pacific North. So I was already with this idea of regionalism in my mind, how to connect different countries throughout the Americas. And I found in the library these 6 thick, massive volumes that propose the idea of Latin American music before anyone else had even thought about the idea that this vast, heterogeneous, complicated, disrupted region had a common musical identity.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this happened in the 1930s, right before World War II. So it's kind of like, what I found out is that cultural and intellectual projects, they happen in waves, and they end up overlapping and sort of aggregating each other to create.
Yeah, one of the words
we consider like natural. And
one of the words you used that I like was like a sedimentation, right? Like it kind of stacks on top of each other. I liked that kind of description. And he compiled these 6 issues, and we say issues, but they're really books, right? I mean, they're huge, thick books with 40 something articles a piece, and over 10 years or so, and maybe a little bit more. And what I found interesting was that he was seen to have kind of an abrasive personality, from what I understand, and he wrote 12,000 letters, and you have an analysis of the letters in the book where you show kind of where his letters went, to whom, like which countries they went to, and you can sort of start to track the dialogue that begins to happen, and how he's tracking. The issues, I think, tend to follow the funding. And they have some. I think the last issue was very U.S. centric. Maybe the second to last was very Brazilian centric, because these countries are trying to establish themselves as part of the dialogue, and then fund the research and the connections. Do I have that right?
No. I'm so happy that you synthesized and elaborated the argument perfectly. Yes. Yeah, I mean, as you just depicted him, he was an intellectual entrepreneur, a cultural builder, someone who was trying to put together official or private funding from different countries around an idea, an encompassing idea. And okay, he was very successful at times, and he ended up failing. In 1946, the final volume of this bulletin was published, and then he sort of lost the momentum.
But you sort of redeem him later, though. I mean, you kind of say he failed, but he didn't really fail, because he created the foundation that then the U.S. really picked up on, like you mentioned before, like in this post-war period. And you show how difficult it was, because even with a lot of funding from the State Department and other sources, like the idea of creating this cohesive regional musical unit was not easy.
No, but it's amazing how in the late 40s and throughout the 50s and 60s, you start having like inter-American or Latin American centers in Tulane, in Los Angeles, in Latin America. And everyone talks about Latin American music as if it were a matter of fact, as something that, as if I talked about, you know, Atlanta and Georgia, nobody thinking, oh no, wait, that's the construction and that
right.
No, it's a natural thing, it's obvious. So in that sense, as you said, he was very successful. The discourse he put together was tremendously influential and still until today. In fact, when I was writing the book, many people, colleagues were like, when I tell them, okay, I'm writing a history of Latin American music. And they were like, okay, what genre?
Yeah.
I was like, whoa. It's not about genres in particular. The very idea that there is a Latin American music. And the response was like, huh, like, you're right. I naturalized a cultural musical category without interrogating where does it come from, who created it, what were the discussions, the funding, the actors, the institutions behind it. And I think that Francisco Kurtlange was like the key actor there in tying all these elements together. It was so successful that he was forgotten, but his invention remained up until today. And if you look in the final chapter 6 of the book, I comment a little bit on how the US music industry perpetuated this idea of a regional sound throughout the idea of Latin music, no?
Yeah, so how does that paper over kind of some of the distinctions among the various artists and styles in the region? Because really, I mean, to be honest with you, 90% of the, and I'm not a good barometer because I'm not, I play a little guitar, but I'm not all that musically knowledgeable. You know, you mentioned so many subgenres and, you know, in various countries and dance styles, things like that, that I've never heard of, right? And of course, you have the big ones that become these musical nationalist projects like samba in Brazil, or tango in Argentina, but then you have so many others. And you kind of make the argument that in some ways it's racialized, right? Like that what got legitimated as nationalist was in some ways trying to inculcate a certain form of perception about the types of people who deserve representation in the national dialogue, right? So, you know, do we, is the US, I guess, complicit in kind of papering over these differences? And do you see a kind of correction to that now that we have this kind of democratization of platforms?
Well, it's a great question. You're right. Every genre within each nation and across nations, all music genres are somehow racialized in the discourse, even in the idea of, in the words we use to describe them or to talk about their origins, what they mean. They're always ethnicized, racialized. And what's curious about Latin music in the United States is that that's no exception. It's also Latin music, a racializing category. But in the United States, the Latin music category encompasses multiple nationalities. So everything coming from Latin America, doesn't matter where, it's Chile, or it's Dominican Republic, or Mexico, Latin, or Latino, or Latinx, as more younger listeners and people in the United States are calling the word that they are using, no?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how, despite, or maybe because of the proliferation of platforms, of media platforms to listen to music and music videos, there is a tendency to consolidate this encompassing category to make sense of the diversity. So, you know, not me, but all the other sociologists have written about how the United States created the very category of Latino out of a mix of three key demographics. No, you have the
you talk about the census,
American Southwest, the Cuban, Florida, and the Puerto Rican Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
How media and activism put them together around, it brought them together around a Latino identity. But now what I'm seeing in Atlanta, when I moved like 4 years ago, is that, Atlanta is not Florida, is not New York, is not California. It's a different place. And yet it's amazing, like 9 or 10% of the state 10%. Population is Latino.
Mm-hmm.
And by Latino, we mean Mexican, but not just Mexicans, but people from all over, and all kinds of concoctions, no? Of personal histories, family histories, of mixes. So that's something, in fact, that I mentioned in the book, but I would like to start maybe one day, or someone, maybe some student I could help conducting a research on how Latino identity in Atlanta is constructed through music. How this, not just as a racializing form of otherness, what anthropologists call otherness, no? When you define others as a different essence, no? Almost like a stereotype, but also as a self embraced.
Like a self-empowerment kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, maybe the papering over is those peoples coming together to assert a collective, identity and will, in a situation where they don't have as much power individually on their own as separate communities. I think that is a fascinating thing to think about. I wanted to remind everybody that the chat function is open for questions. I can keep on going, but wanted to open it up. If you have any questions for Pablo, please type them in and we'll get to those ASAP. So just drop them in. I should have reminded you a long time ago. But I thought that your discussion of Atlanta at the end was obviously relevant to us. You talk about the Latin Fever Ball being the big fundraiser for the Latin American Association, and you talk about Plaza Fiesta, and I know you've taught courses over that took students over there to discuss these issues. So certainly fuel for another conversation for sure. But Colby Hall is asking, how do you see and distinguish the line between imitation and appropriation in the development of various musical styles that emerge from individual countries throughout Latin America? Or does that line even exist in your estimation? I think that's a good question.
Well, it's a great question. It's a question that maybe every musician would respond to that question differently, but probably most would coincide in that where copying ends and re-elaboration of an influence begins. That's a very blurred line. It's inspiration, creativity, cultural production are always the product of, they're always like, even if there's one individual creating a song, the dialogues and the influences are multiple. This is social creativity. And entanglements of producers, composers, performers, audiences, and therefore expectations of, okay, what will work with this audience? What is this producer willing to fund? What am I capable to do? No, I'm not. If you're not Mozart, like most people aren't, you have to be mindful of the techniques and skills and possibilities that you actually have. And in that sense, you're constantly copying. But of course, I see in the question an important point, which is the issue of appropriation. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that even if musicians and artists are copying each other constantly, appropriation means, I would say, establishing a more exploitative relationship with someone else's music. In commercial terms, in terms of fame, prestige. And then I would say that, going back to the previous point, the Latino music in the US, it works in this edge, on this double-edged sword, no, of incorporation and valorization of Latino musical experiences and expressions, but also exploitation. But hey, talking about the global South, and you know, I think that the way economic and productive systems exploit cultural producers, those are global. That's not just with Latino music. That happens with traditionally U.S. musicians, and that happens in Latin America and within the U.S. and within Atlanta. No, in Atlanta there are like segments of the market that are like very much global and connected, and other segments that are like more limited,
right?
And sort of appropriated by the other segments.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about this from an investment standpoint, right? We talked about how internationalized of a city Atlanta is, but then a lot of those pockets of international communities are not connected to that broader binational or cross-border kind of narrative, right? Like they're more like local communities, and so the line between those two things is really interesting to figure out. So Deborah asks, would you talk about the origin of salsa as a genre? I guess you call it a genre. Most U.S. non-Latinos have no idea about the complexity of Latin, quote, Latin music. And so she says there's a need to expand the general understanding about the variety of sources, developments in Latino music and culture. So I guess she wants to hear a little bit more about salsa. And you talk about, I'm not sure if this is relevant, but you talk a lot about Cuba in the book too, as one of the centers of cultural gravity, I guess.
Yeah, no, Afro-Cuban music is one of the most important sources of music, of multiple styles, not just in Cuba, but throughout the Americas and throughout the world. And I mean, if you ask an Argentine to talk about tango, you risk having me like talking for hours and hours about tango. But if you ask an Argentine to talk about salsa, you risk like, you know, having like Puerto Rican and Cuban and Dominican scholars, you know, raise their eyebrows. And it's not my specialty. I love, and I've learned, I read, and I've written a little bit about these genres, but it's not my thing. What I mean, as an Argentine, what calls my attention about salsa is the fact that it's the amazing cross-national networks of people and money and music that connect Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the US. Florida and basically the East, no, but Florida, but also Connecticut, New York, and particularly salsa is, of course, it's New York, no, the Lower East Side in particular. You know, Puerto Rico is one of these nationalities in Latin America in which there are more Puerto Ricans in the US than in the island.
Right.
And that every person and every family is like, it connects or is divided between the two. I would say that salsa is a quintessentially, maybe the quintessentially Latino, US Latino genre, because it was created in the US by foreigners, but foreigners that were seen as foreign, but in fact they were not, because after a generation, you know, all these folks are American.
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. Well, I'm gonna let you stop on that one there, because we got some other ones coming in at the risk of igniting, some passions among your Cuban and Puerto Rican friends. But Derek Bentley asks, could you elaborate a bit more on the relationships among the musical and cultural projects you examine in the States, and I guess in the United States in your case studies? I imagine those interactions alternated between supportive and contentious. Can you speak to the tensions between music as a nationalist project and music seen as a subversive to those projects? What kinds of factors contributed to those vacillations? That's an interesting question.
Excuse me, are we talking about the United States or the national?
I think he means the national
nation states, Pablo. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. I saw this too in the book. There's a sense in which, you know, the the nations are constructing this framework of how music can serve our nationalist interests, but then there's also subversive elements of music that are happening more organically that tend to be suppressed. And I guess Derek wants to see you talk about a little bit about the interplay between those two.
Well, that's a good question, because it points to the success of nationalism. And again, I'm not doing valuing it positively or negatively, just as a historical phenomenon, nationalism. When it works, as it did work in many of these cases, it is because it allows for the two things to happen. It allows for sort of sometimes top-down project of uniformization, sort of a semi-authoritarian imposition of a cultural canon. Like, this is what Peruvians are. This is the music. These are the costumes. These are the myths. But at the same time, to be successful, it needs to be flexible, permeable enough to allow all kinds of actors, whatever their power relation, their position in the power relations are, to invest with their emotions, with their practice, with their symbols, with their meanings, that same national project. So in a sense, all national projects, and I'm talking about the United States too, and any other national project in the world, is a tension. It's a tension between often contradictory claims and contradictory identities. And in music, you see this clearly. In every national genre, when you look at the history, you have very heated debates about what is American music? Is this American music or not? It's about, the origins of the composer. I mean, is Aaron Copland or George Gershwin, can they be representative of American music coming, from, Jewish immigrant families? Or what's the role of native musical traditions in the nation? Are those just like primitive origins that we just want to forget about? Or shall we put them in the center? What's the role of the population, native population in that? In Brazil, it was amazing. Like, you have like tons of composers composing Afro-Brazilian music, and at the same time exploiting Afro-Brazilian composers, robbing them from stealing their compositions, or just paying them a few cents to promote their songs with mixed race or white singers on the radio.
Oh, yeah, you can see that.
Sorry, the other way, a very racist country, a very, very racist country, showcasing amazingly talented Afro-Brazilian artists on the radio, on the TV, on cinema. So you see, you have nationalism gives you avenues to impose racial hierarchy and to subvert them, to integrate and to impose. So I'm talking at a very abstract conceptual level, but if you go into each specific history, you will find examples of each of those, I think. Yeah,
and I think there's some of that in the southern U.S. as well over the years that happened, kind of intersecting with the time frame that you talked about in Latin America. So I want to end with kind of a bigger question, because we had one from Alvaro who says, you say on page 20, I mean, he gets down to the page, Latin American music doesn't exist. Isn't that the same thing as saying Latin America doesn't exist? Maybe there's not Latin American integration, but there are clear representations that make up the music of the region. And I want to expand that question and say, like, how does your conceptualization of Latin America as this framework, how has it stood up in the modern world? Because I think that's really at the center of what we're talking about. Does it exist, or is it a construction, made for other purposes? And that's really where we're going to end it, because I want to get y'all out of here. But I just thought we should drop that in.
Thank you. I think identities and places are things that we should, instead of naturalize or take for granted, we should use them as opportunities to reflect on who we are, where are we, who can we connect, who we connect with, and how. So having cultural, but also economic, political conversations about how can we organize our musical, our cultural, our economic and political life, given the histories that produced us, given the sort of the heritage that brought us here. In that sense, I think that Latin America shouldn't be like romanticized or essentialized as a thing that goes throughout history. No, it has a history. It has multiple tensions, multiple histories, in fact. And maybe I'm saying this as an Argentine or Latin American living in Atlanta. I think Latin America, maybe like Asia or Africa or Europe, other categories too, are opportunities to have cultural conversations about where we come from, where can we go to. But in any case, these are projects.
Yeah.
Goals, horizons, rather than predetermined origins.
And I think that has such relevance for the moment that we're in the world today too, because we're talking about what is the South, right? What is the Southern U.S.? Is it this kind of romanticized version of Gone with the Wind, or is it a new mix of people that's creating a new definition, right? And like it is in Atlanta and some of the urban areas around the South. So I think you still have these tensions that are going on, and I think the more we can talk about these things without limiting them to the kind of labels that we all accept, I mean, the more insight we're going to gain. So Pablo, I appreciate it. This has been fascinating. We are going to send out a recording to those who were not able to make it, but also we'll include a link to the book. Hopefully everybody will purchase it. I've got my copy. It's from Oxford University Press. We'll send you a link. And I love the photo that you chose to include on the cover. That was really great. And you have it, you kind of explain it more toward the end of the book. So you have to kind of read to find out. But again, thank you for joining us, especially being on the West Coast. We will try, I think we're going to try at least by August to start doing these in person. So we'd love to have all of you join us. I know that our August guest is going to be Kirk Bowman from Georgia Tech, who's going to talk about rethinking global philanthropy, using some case studies from around Brazil mainly. But we hope to continue this series as a monthly series, again, sponsored by the Atlanta Global Studies Center. Thank you, Pablo. Really appreciate it. Giving you a round of applause. I hope to see you soon in Atlanta.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.